I know, yes.
Good morning. Time to get started. Hello, Miss Brenda. Can you hand these out, please? Well, last week we had between 15 and 20 back there on that side that were visitors. That really looked good. But I don't know if y'all noticed, but there was 84 here last week. That was a good feeling. Shame they weren't staying. Did you get one, Doug? There it is. Very good. All right. We're going to finish up the historical Christological heresies in a minute. But we've been studying and talking about the creeds and why they use the creeds and the significance of that during the time of they didn't have the canon put together. And so there was all kinds of false teachings trying to come into the church, and the church was trying to fight it off. They didn't have scriptures basically throughout the lands, because the gospel had spread, because we talked about the Roman Empire had made it kind of a system of roads that was easy to travel, a contingency where everybody basically was under certain leadership. The paperwork's back there on the back, please. Right? No, right here on the stand. There you go. Thank you. And so things were working well for the church except false teachers. And then we talked about the creeds and what was going on. If you would turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 3. First Corinthians chapter 3. Let me find it because I've got a different Bible here. Verses 1 and 2. Could someone read that for us? Sorry. Go ahead.
As to spiritual people, but as to carnal, as to babes in Christ, I fed you with milk and not with solid food, for until now you were not able to receive it, and even now you are still not able.
Okay. So, from my standpoint, when it comes to the creeds, there are still churches that read it, and I've heard of some that the creed they were using was way off, and I've heard that others are using the creeds and the young people read it every week. They use a certain creed to read. And so my thought is a young person that's growing and looking to Christ and learning is still in the milk stage. And they don't know all the gospel, and they don't know all the word, and they're trying to put it all together. So if they read a creed, it's totally different than someone like me or you that's been in the church for a long time. And so we should be further along than the creeds as mature adults and mature Christians. All righty. Any questions on that or different thought? So I put all that about the creeds together and showed why, but then I thought, well, you know, we ought to say that there is a time to move on. Okay. Historical Christological heresies. I gave you a list last week and we covered those. I'm going to give you about 7 or 8 minutes to look over all this, and then we'll go back over 2 or 3 of them and then go a little further. So just read. You have the proponents down on the left, everything, the viewpoints of these 3 groups, and then you have time, denial, explanation, condemned, associated with, and argument. So go ahead and spend the time to read that. Everybody about through? Okay. Last week we covered the Ebionites, the Doicists, and the Arians. And remember, the controversy is over the Christ. And I've got another sheet that it talks about the Christ and a lot of things going on. But I was reading over it last night, and I'm going, I don't know if I'm quite ready to deal with this one, because it was a little harder and a little more difficult to work with. But the heresies are going on. The conflicts are going on. And even as the Bible is written, when we were going to church in Ozark, Missouri, Barbara had bought a Schofield, I think it was a Schofield Bible. And, we just thought we was another Bible. And the preacher saying, there's some things in the Schofield Bible you got to be careful with. Well, and he kind of explained it, but I didn't really think about it much. But then I was listening to somebody a couple of days ago, and they were going, this guy was a scoundrel. He was not. And of course, we look back, and King James was kind of a scoundrel too. So we have to be careful even today with segments of the Bible. There's a couple of scriptures in the Bible that are in there that actually weren't in the original. We won't get into that today, so we still have to be careful, but the overall thought process, even as those two scriptures, is true to other words that are in the Bible. And so even though it's not something that's in the original, it's not out of context. All right. So let's cover some of these. The Apollinarians. If you look down to the explanation, the divine logos took the place of the human mind. Logos means the Word of God, or divine reason, or created order, or basically Jesus. Jesus is the Logos. So if the divine Logos took the place of the human mind, then how could Christ be, how could he really be both natures? And so since if he wasn't both natures, he couldn't do and fulfill the promise. The Nestorians, in explanation, union was moral, not organic. Thus, two persons, the human was completely controlled by the divine. Well, organic means related to or derived from living matter. So, was the Christ born? Yes. Was he begotten but not, what was the word I used last week? Created. He was not created, he was begotten. He was here from all times. There was just a manifestation. He went from from the Word unto the Christ, meaning human and divine. All right, and the last one, monophysistis, something like that. The human nature was swallowed by the divine to create a new third nature, a tertium quid. Well, there was only two natures described in the Bible, the Son of God and the Son of Man. I don't read of a third nature anywhere. So we see that the next one is condemned. Each one is condemned at certain councils. We covered some of the councils, and under the Nestorians, the Synod, or the coming together of Ephesus of AD 431. And the last one, the Council of Chalcedon. And if we look back at the Apollinarians under associated with, the Logos, reason all people. call people the Logos, the Christ? No. Now, once we become a Christian and we become a brother, we're still not divine in the sense of the Christ. And so they're getting that confused too. Now, the associated with, if we look under the Nestorians, word man, antecedent, not word flesh, Alexandrian Christology, opposed to using the Theotokos of Mary. Does anybody know what that means? Mother of God. And so she was the mother of Jesus, and she was the mother of the Christ, but they are going to say the Eastern Christianity is really going to get into the Mother of God, because they're going to start pushing the idea of what? That you can pray through Mary, because Mary will hear. I mean, why would she reject her son? Or he reject his mother? Excuse me, the other way around. And so that's going in Eastern Christianity is going to be influenced. All right. Argument 4, affirm Christ's deity and real humanness. Under Apollinarians, under Nestorians, distinguish human Jesus who died from divine Son who cannot die. So they're going to be forced to be dealt with, because they're saying the Son, the begotten Son, the Christ, never died. All right. Look at the argument against, next to the last, and the center. If the death of Jesus was the act of human person, not of God, it cannot be effectuous. In other words, efficacious, yes, that's the way I think you should say it. What does that mean? Anybody? Efficacious. How could he save if he didn't have this greater energy or this greater divinity? He maybe went to the cross, but how could he really save anybody? And so it gets so complicated that these people are always throwing all this in the mix. And if you get rid of Jesus, what have you gotten rid of? Salvation. So if you can, when lawyers go to prosecute somebody, their job is to what? Muddy the water enough that what? You have doubt. Oh, did he? Oh. Well, what is the defense going to do? The same thing. So the defense is going to, let's muddy the waters enough that we can get this guilty person off. Because all we're looking for is a certain amount. Well, what are false teachers doing here? Leading people off the wrong path, because they don't believe in an objective truth. If you don't believe in an objective truth, and you can demolish the Christ, and I was talking to somebody the other day, and we were talking about a certain religion, and he said, and I had already looked it up, but he said they believe differently in God. They see God in a totally different context than we do. And I go, well, I thought it was the other part of the Godhead. And so I looked it up again and reread it, and it's nothing that I had ever read before. But anyway, now let's go to the barbarians and the rituals of the church. This is where the church is again going to get really really, did I actually, whoop, I skipped a page somewhere. Nope, not here. Ah. Yeah, the second page. I didn't put my original back in my folder here. The conversion of the barbarian tribes, and I brought up the Vikings the other day and whatever, but here's a list of the ones that the Christianity is going to have to deal with in the beginning. No, a barbarian is someone that is basically a warrior. How did the Jews look at the Gentiles? Do what? Like dogs. They looked at them down. In other words, they weren't civilized. They weren't educated. They weren't sophisticated. And so the barbarians are going to be warriors that have all these mythologies and all these ways of connecting to their God, and they're all about conquest. They're kind of like the Muslims, or Islam, not Muslims, Islam, the conquerors. So their philosophy is, go take land, go take over. We want to control. And they're starting to have missionaries, like you see here, come in and actually convert a lot of them because they are into religion. But they just have this warrior concept. So it's barbarian means a warrior or somebody that's not like us. In other words, where did the Christians come from, and the Roman Empire and all them? They were basically philosophical. Paperwork's right there, please. They were philosophical, the Greek, the Romans. They had all these philosophers and everything, sophisticated. So they looked down on the Gentiles. All right, so we have the Goths, the Picts, the Irish, the Franks, the Scots, the Angles, and the Saxons later, I guess that's later Anglo-Saxons, and the Frisians. And we see they start around 340. The C, I think, stands for about the time of, or CA usually means about the time of. The 400, 435, 496, 563, 600, 690. And if I remember correctly, around 600 is where 500, 600 is where the Roman Empire is really collapsing. All right, the next page, please. The barbarians and the rituals of the church. Is there one to read the first four, please? Brett, you started earlier.
The practice union of the church and the state under Constantine and his successors led to the secularization of the church. The patriarchs of Constantinople came under the control of the emperor and the Eastern Church department of the state. The influx of pagans into the church through the mass conversion movements of the era contributed to paganization of worship as the church tried to make these barbarian converts feel at home within its fold. Number 4, the influx of pagans caused the church to call upon the state to help enforce discipline by using the temporal power to punish ecclesiastical offenses.
Okay. So any religious offenses they considered religious. The church didn't have a lot of money. At this time, it didn't have a lot of influence because this went through what? First few hundred years. It went through growth, false teachers, no money, not lots of money, and the state was basically destroying a lot of the Christians. In other words, they was under the threat of being persecuted. So a lot of times they were hidden. They went underground. And so who are they using to enforce their rules? The government. Because Constantine is going to be the person, if I remember correctly, that says, if I see a sign when I go to war, then I will look at becoming Christian and accept it. And he does. He sees a cross in the sky, flaming cross. And it's clouds, I guess, but it looked like a flaming cross. So the church is going to be struggling with the influence of what kind of people? Barbarians or pagans. What's a pagan? A pagan is anybody out, basically a Gentile or anybody outside the church. Christianity, they're considered pagans. If they worship false gods, if they worship mythologies, if they worship statues, idolatry, anything like that. And so since these are the kind of people being brought into the church, can you imagine that all at once this church doubled in size and everybody's from not a religious background like the church? Can you imagine what the elders would have to deal with? That's why a lot of people are scared of too much growth, because you can get into some, I don't know, I've sat around with men of other religious body and heard some of the discussions we had when I was young, and I can't imagine if you brought a bunch of outsiders in that have no clue. And then you got to ask the question. I was at a church that they appointed 2 elders, and both of them went to a different religious body after a short time. 2 elders. So were they really, and this church they went to was not really, I'd say, scriptural. So were they really grounded? So leadership is important, guys. All right, 5 through 7, please. Anybody?
Discipline became lax within the church because its resources were overtaxed in handling the many barbarians who had only been partially converted from pagans. The influx of barbarians and the growth of episcopal power also brought changes in the worship services of the church. Seventh question: if the barbarians who had been used to worshiping images were to find any real help in the church, many church leaders believed it would be necessary to materialize the liturgy to make God seem more accessible to the worshiper.
Okay. So the resources were short. They were overtaxed, meaning not taxes in money, but overtaxed in just the workload. And were the Christians that sophisticated? Most of them. No, because of where they come from. Most of them weren't leaders, meaning high-ups, educated. And so that's why the creeds came about. At least they had some stability with that. And episcopal power just means governed by or having. They didn't use elders back then. They didn't use that term that much. They used the word bishop. And bishop and elder means what? Overseer. And so these people, and I've heard other churches talk about, they had a preacher that was trying to do it all and be involved in everything and just overtaxed, overloaded, and not getting enough help, because it's kind of like the principal or superintendent at a school. The board members don't have a clue most of the time what's going on until they come to the meeting, and then they learn what's going on, and then they catch up. All right. So in 313, Constantine creates the Edict of Milan. Milan is where? Italy. Okay. And it creates religious freedom before the Christians, because they've been persecuted and they've been basically ran underground. But now he's making religious freedom because of what he saw in the sky. And then in 380 AD, Theodosius, he creates what's called the Edict of Thessalonica. He creates a degree of, well, I can't read my writing, of something. He made Christianity a state religion. Well, can you name me one state, not in the United States, but one country that made their religion a state religion? And can you name me the person that made it a state religion? Not here, not this, but what person around the 1500s made their country have its own religious body? Henry VIII. Henry VIII. He made the Church of England. And why did he do that, Linda? Linda, why did he do that? He wanted to divorce his wife, and the church, Catholic Church, would not let him divorce. So he made his own religion and fought them. And of course, you had church and state. And so we had all this tying together. And he just basically said, I'll show you. Well, now, once he did that, and started his own way, you had a lot of fighting going on and a lot of arguments because of the Catholic Church versus his church. And he came up with, I think it was 12 principles that he wanted to see in that church. Well, now, my understanding, the Church of England has not only a female over it all, but is pushing gay rights and is having gay whatever inside the church, and is gone completely where he would have not taken it. So anyway, it's not that it doesn't happen. And to finish that off, if there is a dispute in England over church, questioning the church about what is right and wrong, who makes the final decision? It's a state religion. The Parliament makes the final decision. Very good. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Linda. All right. Number 8, 9, and 10. The veneration of angels, saints, relics. I don't know why I put it down twice, but relics on top of relics. Pictures and statues was a logical outcome of this attitude. The connection with the monarchical state also led to a change from a simple democratic worship to a more aristocratic, colorful form of liturgy with a sharply drawn distinction between the clergy and the laity. Remember, we're talking about Catholic, which means basically universal church. And then it becomes free, and then it becomes a state religion, and once it becomes a state religion, there's all this back and forth. And remember, I said that, in my opinion, the reason they started having you confess in the sinner's box because the priest wanted to know what was going on in the community, and so he might come up with a way of actually fighting the person in charge, the king. And so it didn't start out legitimate, and then later indulgences are going to be sold in the church, and it's going to end up causing a lot more problems because, you go to the priest and you can buy these indulgences and you can sin all you want. All right. So, veneration of angels. Now we're worshiping or putting priorities in angels, saints, and pictures and statues. Number 9, the connection with the monarchical state also led to a change. Oh, I already read that. Clergy and laity. Then what happens later? If you were Catholic in the 50s, could you understand, in a Catholic church, could you understand what they were saying? No. What did they do back then, Barbara? The Mass was in Latin. And you were what? English. So you couldn't understand a word they said. But what did they have? Colorful Mass, colorful materialism, and using some of the same things of the Old Testament, like what? What do they walk around with? Incense. Okay. Number 10. A church calendar is established and Sunday becomes prominent. Well, what did they do in the very beginning? Met in the people's what? Homes. Or, if I remember correctly, they also, before Jews and the Christians really separated, they would sometimes be allowed to go into the synagogue, but most of the time it was on the outer court of the synagogue. And they would worship or have their meetings in the outer court, and then they started separating men and women and things like that. Excuse me, I got to get a drink. Woke up this morning, couldn't hardly talk. The festival of Christmas becomes a regular practice. The adoption of the December date is established because it is previously used by the who? Pagans. So paganism is going to start sliding into the church a lot. The pagans are going to have lots of influence. Even though they're becoming Christians, they're using some of their background because if you're wanting people to fit in, what do? You water down truth. You water down the gospel. The Feast of Epiphany, which is in the West, celebrated the coming of the Magi to see Christ, and in the East, the baptism of Christ. So in the West and East are having separate things going on, and then the accretions from the Jewish sacred year, so now they're looking back to the Jews and going, we're going to bring in some of yours, so we want to keep accepting the Jews. And then the gospel history. And the last thing is the lives of the saints and the martyrs led to an expansion of holy days on church calendars. I don't know if I'll pass out church calendars and things like that because of what was going on. When it comes to the Magi, they were using this as and I didn't finish my sentence here, manifestation of Christ to the Gentiles as represented by the Magi. And they use the scripture Matthew 2, 1 through 12. So what have we learned here? Let's give a little objective recall. What's going on here? Lot of change in the church. And why are they changing? Because
A lot of it was, the growth was, I don't want to say forcing clergy to make concessions, but they were trying to be inclusive to an extent and accepting certain heresy in order to either further political agendas or conform to some of these pagan groups that they were absorbing in the church.
okay,
Especially in the case of St. Patrick in Ireland, a lot of the Irish weren't converted, they were just absorbed.
absorbed.
So, yeah, a lot of that paganism, the Druidism, for instance, you talk about Theotokos, Mary, the worship of Mary was accepted within the church, even going so far as to say that she was a co-redeemer with Christ because of the feminine in ancient Irish religion being such a huge church.
Okay. The next week, we're going to get into a lot more of that, where a lot of things are being accepted that are being really pushed. And I'm just going to use this illustration. This is an illustration. Barbara and I went to Vancouver. She went to, while she was teaching, she went up there for a conference. And she told, and I may use this, but she told me, so why don't you go to the museum and see that? And there's some churches down the street. And so I went to the museum. Of course, that was an interesting topic. But then I went to a church. And when I walked inside, over to the left was a huge table with nothing but gay material and advertising all the gay stuff going on and whatever. And over here on the other side was a little bitty table about Christianity in the church. So I looked for the minister and couldn't find him. I almost got in trouble because I was in places I shouldn't have been looking for him. I just won't talk to him and say why. So I went back and asked our Church of Christ administrator, said, what in the world is going on in our churches? And he said, well, they're trying to fit in and be accepted. And I go, wait a minute. Who's supposed to be accepted by who? And the question is, and I'm not going to get too deep on this, and I told Barbara this yesterday or the day before, there's a Lutheran pastor that has struggles with homosexuality, and he used to be with the ECLA Lutheran Church, which is most Lutheran, and that's what our friends are. And he comes on Facebook all the time talking about and showing pictures of what's going on in a lot of the Lutheran and Methodist and United Church of Christ, where they're putting banners of that all over the churches and promoting it and putting on the windows and all this. And so the same thing, I'm not saying good or bad, well, I'm just saying this is what's going on in society, because it's going on. But we may not see it here, but it's going on. And so his thing is, I struggle with homosexuality. Said I had tendencies and I struggle, but I know it's a sin, and so I stepped out of that and went to the regular Lutheran church because I'm scared. I'm scared of not my salvation and where I'm going. And so his thing is, I just want to keep you informed. And I'm struggling. I'm struggling with what I had to leave because I love that church. And he said, I go back and sometimes talk to some of these bishops and whatever, and the gay, lesbian, female ministers, but they're just openly promoting. And so the question is, can it happen if you don't have strong leadership? Like I say, I've been around a lot of different religious bodies, and people have to fight in a lot of these churches to keep them pure. I mean, they really have to fight. And I'm not talking about just Church of Christ. What they see is pure, they have to fight and discuss and sometimes argue. And as I said last week, sometimes tell a person in the church, you're out of line, you must leave. Now, is that hard? For that administrator, it was hard. And I remember growing up and being a little older, starting back to church, and just about at least once a month, they discussed, well, what do we do if we have this happen in the church? And I remember all the men sitting around because, you know, this discussion came up. They had to discipline a woman in Oklahoma City, I think, because she was living with somebody in sin. And they disciplined her and tried to kick her out of the church, and she went to court and won. And the court said, yes, you will keep her in the church. You don't have a right. And if you go study things going on in Canada and in England with churches, it's scary. It's not here. We have freedoms that are blessings. Okay. Any more thought process or questions or whatever? I didn't mean to get on a tangent, but folks, what happened here has happened all through history. This is 6th century, 7th century, 8th century, 9th century, 10th century, 11th century, 12th century. And as I read to you a long time ago, that a lot of the popes were good, honest people, but a lot of them were scoundrels. And like one of them hated the man in front of him that was a pope and dug him up and burned his body before they put him back in the ground because he hated him that much. And Barbara and I have watched some shows where the papacy was bought, actually bought because of this. And one man inside of Henry VIII's council, Barbara and I went to the place, is a huge estate, and the king got mad at him and said he was afraid he was going to kill him, and so he handed over the whole estate to the king, and it is gorgeous, just to save his life. So don't think power doesn't sway people and do things. All right, any questions, any comments? Anything you're mad at me about? Okay. Just giving a warning of why it's good to have elders and leaders. And a church that's willing to be told no. Let me tell you, sometimes that's hard too. Thank you.